Well, good morning and welcome to the launch of the 2012 edition of the Military Balance, our annual assessment of global military capabilities. Joining me to respond to your questions today are Douglas Barry, Senior Fellow for Military Aerospace, Brigadier Ben Barry, Senior Fellow for Land Warfare, Dr. Toby Dodge, Consulting Senior Fellow for the Middle East, Mark Fitzpatrick, Director of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program, James Hackett, Editor of the Military Balance, Nigel Inkster, Director for Transnational Threats and Political Risk, Christian Lemire, Research Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security, Alex Nichol, Director of Editorial, and Giri Rajendran, Research Analyst for Economics, as well as Adam Ward, our Director of Studies. This year's Military Balance sees further improvements to the book's presentation, information, and assessments. The land data sections have been revised to improve understanding of the combined arms capabilities of modern land forces, and the book carries extra detail on Army's combat support, such as engineering assets. We analyze policy and defense economic questions for the countries with the largest defense budgets in greater detail than before. For many nations, the ISS this year includes brief textual summaries of countries' military capabilities to help inform readers' understanding of the purely numerical data. Also, for the first time, the book has brief assessments of individual states' cyber capabilities, including relevant organizations and assessed capacities. Concepts associated with this emerging realm, such as what constitutes military cyber power, remain matters for debate. Last year, the IISS published an Adelphi book entitled Cyberspace and the State. In it, the authors noted that military cyber power could be defined as the use or threatened use of cyberspace and other resources to effect strategic aims in and through cyberspace against the resistance or wishes of others. Of course, what assets, doctrines, and experienced states deploy are vital to any such assessment, and the Military Balance will expand this analysis on cyber power in future editions of the book. We publish this edition of the Military Balance as the world's attention is focused on another crisis emerging from the upheavals in the Arab world. This time last year, the potential for foreign intervention in Libya was being much discussed. This year, Syria is employing substantial military assets in an attempt to suppress dissent. Yet the difficulties of foreign military engagement are pronounced in Syria. While there are now regional calls to arm the opposition, the practical difficulties of doing this and of the external intervention, sometimes mooted, are formidable. Against this background, President Assad's apparent strategy has been to secure regime loyalists and, of course, suppress the opposition, while keeping the level of conflict below that which would risk triggering international intervention. In Libya, the situation was in many ways favorable for intervention. There was a clear mandate to act. Libya is on Europe's doorstep, so NATO's limited airlift capability was not tested, and its coastline allowed maritime power to be brought to bear, and the rebels had a clear base and objective. The war was noteworthy in other respects. The U.S. mainly withdrew early on from a combat role, though it still provided enabling capacities vital to the mission's success. The campaign was also noteworthy because of the overwhelming predominance of precision-guided air-launched munitions, setting a new standard for those taking part in future such operations. One lesson of recent events in the Middle East and North Africa is that what have seemed on paper to be extensive and modern combat forces have been exposed as relatively small corps of favored and well-equipped troops, of which the primary purpose is to bolster regimes. Further, the degree of involvement of leaders' families in the armed forces has proved influential. In Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain, where the security services remained cohesive or fought back, relations of the rulers were entrusted with key command responsibilities. In Tunisia and Egypt, by contrast, where there were no rulers' relations in senior army and police positions, the regular military distanced itself from the regime that was under threat. What is clear is that the political and military landscape in the Middle East and North Africa is now being reshaped with long-held assumptions about regional power balances, military capabilities, and deterrence being challenged. For example, the Arab awakening has seen unprecedented willingness by several Arab governments to back and participate in military operations. Both Qatar and the United Arab Emirates deployed combat forces during the Libyan campaign, while the Gulf Cooperation Council deployment to Bahrain demonstrated a differing form of military activism, with forces sent to free up Bahrain's forces to conduct internal security operations. This year's military balance discusses Arab militaries and the Arab awakening in a special essay with a focus on the war in Libya. And another essay looks at lessons of recent conflicts for future combat capabilities. Meanwhile, the global distribution of military power and of defense spending continues. Since the financial crisis in 2008, there has been a convergence in European and Asian defense spending levels. While per capita spending levels in Asia remain significantly lower than those in Europe, on the current trend, Asian defense spending is likely to exceed that of Europe in nominal terms during 2012. In Europe, defense budgets remain under pressure and cuts continue to procurement programs, equipment holdings, and defense organizations. Between 2008 and 2010, there have been reductions in defense spending in at least 16 European NATO member states. In a significant proportion of these, real-term declines have exceeded 10%. The effect of these cuts across European states was brought into focus by the campaign in Libya, which highlighted existing gaps in targeting, tanker aircraft, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Questions were also raised about the stock holdings of certain nations' precision-guided weapons. But given the continuing pressure on European public finances, there is little chance that defense budgets will reverse their downward trends anytime soon. Some European countries are exploring ways to pool and share capabilities so as to save money while creating the same or even improved capability. This forms part of the so-called Smart Defense Initiative proposed by NATO Secretary General. Pooling and sharing raises awkward issues, such as that of mutual dependence. Some states may question whether they can rely on others to make capabilities available when needed. At its Chicago summit in May this year, NATO will identify areas of capability in which member states will push forward the Smart Defense Initiative. But NATO needs to direct this process. Otherwise, states, driven by domestic financial priorities and national political timelines, may pay too little attention to such alliance-wide priorities. The United States, too, has begun to reduce defense spending after a period of substantial expansion. A reassessment of policy and strategy continues. The goal is that the long stability operations of the past decade will not be probably undertaken in the future. The Pentagon's new strategic guidance indicates a rebalancing towards the Asia-Pacific, spurred by Washington's perception of its economic and security interests in Asia, as well as concerns over anti-access strategies that could be employed by regional competitors. While this is an important shift in the longer term, it is modest in terms of its immediate effect. American troop numbers in Europe will fall by 10,000 to around 70,000, while Marines are deployed to Australia and littoral combat ships to Singapore. The Pentagon is being forced by Congress to make hard choices. In manpower terms, the Army and Marines will see the largest cuts, but all services will have programs curtailed, canceled, or delayed. Still, the extent of these cuts should not be exaggerated. The U.S. will remain by far the world's major military power and the only NATO member capable of sustaining large air-to-sea operations or projecting substantial ground forces on a global scale for a sustained period. While the West reduces its spending on defense, Asia is becoming increasingly militarized as a result of rapid economic growth and strategic uncertainty. In 2011, Asian defense spending increased overall by 3.15% in real terms, a figure that would have been higher but for rising inflation in the region. China, Japan, India, South Korea, and Australia accounted for more than 80% of total Asian defense spending. Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam are all investing in improving air and naval capacities, as are India, Japan, and South Korea. India, for instance, plans to boost maritime capacities with submarines and aircraft carriers. China, the region's top spender, has, according to IISS estimates, increased its share of regional expenditure to more than 30%. Beijing's official expenditure in 2011 was more than 2.5 times the 2001 level. There has been much attention on China's aircraft carrier and J-20 combat aircraft. But China's technological advances are more modest than some alarmist hypotheses of its military development have suggested. They represent nascent rather than actual capacity. China, for example, does not yet have the capability to operate fixed-wing aircraft from an aircraft carrier. However, China's development of anti-satellite capacities, anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and cyber warfare capabilities preoccupies foreign defense planners as much as its drive to boost major platform capability. Its growing suite of modern platforms reinforces the gradual change in the balance of power across the Taiwan Strait. That said, the strategic priorities of the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, are gradually widening from the defense of China's borders to forced projection within East Asia and further afield in order to secure sea lines of communication. Meanwhile, the world is not short of potential flashpoints in continuing conflicts. The Korean Peninsula remains tense, and concerns persist over Pyongyang's nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. The death of Kim Jong-il and assumption of power by his son, Kim Jong-un, heightens concerns about further North Korean nuclear and missile tests and military aggression, concerns that will only be alleviated to a limited extent by last week's agreement with the United States. Further south, gunboat diplomacy and brief confrontations between naval, paramilitary, and civilian vessels continued in the South China Sea in 2011. Military exercises and rhetoric increased during the year. China's leadership transition is expected to begin this year, and during leadership transitions, sensitive issues that impinge on questions of national sovereignty are naturally subject to particular attention. Naval competition in the South China Sea will likely continue, and interested states will still pursue naval procurements. Managing tensions in the South China Sea will be an increasing priority. In the Middle East, regional and international states remain concerned by Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, and tensions remain high. In February, the IAEA confirmed several advances in Iran's uranium enrichment programs. 3 times as many centrifuges are now producing 20% enriched uranium, including 700 centrifuges operating in a deeply buried facility in Fordow. At the other buried facility at Natanz, 9,000 centrifuges are operating compared to only 6,000 in November. Iran has introduced what it called a 4th-generation centrifuge, although in practice it still relies almost entirely on 1st-generation models. The expansion of 20% enrichment, which is close to weapons usable, and the move to Fordow heightens concerns in Israel, which has strongly hinted at launching a preemptive attack before Iran enters what Israel styles a zone of immunity. Washington has appealed for patience on grounds that Iran is not on the verge of producing nuclear weapons, that Israeli airstrikes would set back Iran's program by only a couple of years, and that sanctions are now having a real impact on Iran. The EU embargo on the purchase of Iranian oil is among the more significant sanctions. It has prompted threats from Tehran to close the Strait of Hormuz. Iran could attempt this by mining the strait, using anti-ship missiles, or using torpedoes or rockets, perhaps launched from Iran's fleet of submarines or fast attack craft. While these capabilities could disrupt shipping temporarily, the U.S. and its allies maintain significant maritime assets in the region and would soon be able to reopen the strait. But other options are open to Iran. It could try to avoid giving cause for response by adopting more bureaucratic modalities, such as increasing transit times by imposing demands on vessels using the waters it controls as part of the traffic separation scheme in the Gulf. Turning to the two recent major wars, the U.S. military presence in Iraq ended in December 2011. Iraq's security forces have been steadily politicized, with Prime Minister al-Maliki securing control over the armed forces through appointments. This may have made a coup unlikely, but it has introduced incoherence to the Iraqi chain of command. Iraq's security forces will probably be able to impose a rough order on the country. They will not, however, be able to defend the country's borders or airspace. In Afghanistan, the army and police continue to expand in number, but questions remain over their real capability. Western government's intention to withdraw combat forces by 2015 makes more pressing the need for Afghan security forces to assume full responsibility for independent planning, mission execution, and sustainment. It also increases the pressure on Kabul and its international supporters to remedy the institutional weakness in Afghan governance that has so bedeviled the NATO campaign. The ISS has recently examined in Afghanistan to 2015 and beyond these issues in its recently published Delphi book. The 2012 military balance contains a wealth of analysis of regional and global defense developments and trends, as well as a rich detail on military capabilities around the world. It tracks the continuing progress of Russia's defense reforms, the retrenchment and cautious policy development seen last year in Brazil, the emerging security crisis in Mexico and Central America, and defense developments in sub-Saharan Africa. The divergent trends in defense spending between the West and Asia that we've highlighted today do not necessarily translate into immediate shift in global military capabilities. The U.S. and Western nations will look to maintain a qualitative and quantitative edge over states such as China through continued investment in research and development, as well as an emphasis on the quality and reliability of equipment, leadership, and training. They will focus on maximizing value from partnership and cooperation arrangement. Further advances may be sought also in advanced technology areas such as unmanned systems, C4ISR capabilities, and information and cyber capacities. But the gaps are narrowing. A challenge for the West will be how, in an age of fiscal austerity, to retain the high level of military skills developed through 10 years of continuous multinational combat operations when these operations draw to a close, as well as what capabilities procured for these wars should be retained. Non-Western states with diverse military experiences and defense priorities may look to the West for lessons and perhaps pointers relating to useful capabilities, organizations, and tactics, but they will be less constrained financially in procuring these. The ISS Defense and Military Analysis Program, as well as the wider ISS research program, will continue through our publications and research activity. We hope to provide detailed, nuanced, and cogent analyses of these issues. And as advertised, we're very much ready now to take your questions on any of the themes raised in this press statement or others that appear in the book. Yes. If you just wait 1 second for the microphone, thank you, and give us your name.
Good morning, it's Marta Migdałek, Associated Press. My question is, how would you compare the developments in Homs, Syria, to what happened in Srebrenica in 1995? Thank you.
Well, Toby Dodge first, and then maybe Ben Barry, who was there. Toby Dodge.
I wonder if there is any analytical utility in comparing two sieges and the deployment of violence by a state against its society. I would go on, though, to say that clearly the regime is engaged now in driving the civilian support of the demonstrations against it from Homs, and we see a sustained reporting about human rights abuses beyond the use of artillery and weapons that have clearly killed a lot of civilians. That said, and I guess this is where your question is going, there clearly is not the international diplomatic momentum needed to break through the deadlock in the Security Council or push for some form of intervention. So in that sense, although it's undoubted that the Syrian government has indeed greatly abused the human rights of its population, specifically in Homs, I don't think the diplomatic situation is going to change anytime soon.
Ben?
Just to complement what Toby said, I think the lesson to draw from Srebrenica, which is of universal applicability, is there is no sense in declaring safe areas or humanitarian corridors without the military ways and means to actually protect them. And the whole problem with Srebrenica is the declaration of the safe area was not adequately supported by military force. Now, the problem with Syria is identifying quite clearly political and military options that are going to make the problem better rather than worse. And at this stage, it's really quite difficult.
Just to add that I think the Western powers would welcome a move from Turkey to do something like that, but there's no indication that Turkey has the political will to do that.
Yes.
John Ingham, Daily Express. I just wondered about the thorny issue of the Falklands and Argentina. I just wondered what your assessment is of how serious a military threat Argentina poses. Is it seriously considering retaking them as an option, and could Britain recapture the islands if that were to happen?
Christian Lemire?
Yes, and we see the position between Argentina and the UK as very different to that 30 years ago, both politically and militarily. The domestic political situation in Argentina is far from the dictatorship that existed in the early 1980s. Militarily speaking, the islands are better defended, and it would be certainly more of a challenge for Argentina to take them in any form. That doesn't mean a concerted campaign wouldn't be successful, but it would certainly tax the Argentinian forces to a greater extent. In 1982, we had a very, very small contingent of Marines in the Falkland Islands. Now we have 4 Typhoons, up to 1,000 troops, and at least 3 vessels are in the region in the South Atlantic. As to whether we could retake the islands, I think that's speculation that's very difficult to confirm in any way. Really, it depends what we committed to the campaign. It depends what Argentina had on the islands at the time. So it's not really something I would like to confirm or deny.
Yes.
Andrew Swidlicki from the Polish news agency. How do you assess the prospect for defense and foreign policy under Putin presidency?
Who'd like to take that? Maybe Nigel Inkster?
My gosh. It's not my area of expertise at all. I mean, I think obviously it's obvious where Putin's instincts lie in this area. He wants to see Russia re-emerge as a strong state in a kind of in a kind of 20th century conception of what a strong state might look like, and having credible and capable armed forces is an important part of that. But I think the barriers to implementation are going to be very considerable. If you look, for example, at Russia's military industries, it's difficult to avoid concluding that these risk being close to terminal decline, suffered from decades of underinvestment and an absence of rejuvenation of the engineers and scientists that would be needed to implement new programs. And I think that Russia is now at the point of being overtaken by China in terms of defense industry capability. It's not quite happened yet, but it's certainly something that Russian strategic thinkers worry a lot about. I think also, from a conventional perspective, there are considerable problems about modernization of Russia's conventional armed forces. And there is a larger question, underpinning all of this, is what are they for? What are they actually there to defend against? What is their role? Russia is involved in various counterinsurgency campaigns in the North Caucasus, but most of these are, to the extent possible, being fought through local proxies, and the armed forces they've got are not well configured, to undertake counterinsurgency campaigns, as we saw in Chechnya. It's done through the overwhelming application of conventional military force with no concerns for the impact on civilian populations. So, and also, we need to look at the wider political and economic context in which Putin has to operate. And we've seen from these recent elections that the political complexion of Russia is starting to change. I mean, Putin could have won this election without having to engage in voter manipulation or, to put it bluntly, fraud. But he couldn't be sufficiently confident of his position to do that. And the reality is that he is confronting a different kind of political opposition from that which he has had to face up until now, and one which looks to be potentially more articulate and perhaps more effective over the long term. So I think the kind of politics that have served Vladimir Putin quite well for the past decade are going to be harder to implement than they have been. So all of these are factors that militate, I think, against a major and rapid resurgence of Russia as a conventional military power.
I think 2 points I would add before James Hackett comes in on this is that the military balance records the increasing intended expenditure on defense by the administration, and that if these present trends were maintained, we say that Russia could be spending at least 5% of GDP on defense. But it's very debatable whether Moscow would be able to sustain that level of expenditure. And in the past, when it's announced ambitious expenditure, it hasn't always met it. And the second broader political point I would make is that given the way in which people in Russia have opposed the very prefabricated politics that Putin has championed, it may well be the case that Putin over the next year or two needs to concentrate more on his domestic politics and would not wish to have unnecessary problems with countries to its west. James Hackett?
Thanks, John. Just to add a little bit on military reform, I think, well, Putin's election might lead to a change in tone in debate or the tenor of debates. I don't think there'll be actual changes in a shift in the direction of Russian defence reform. I mean, if you look at how it's been forced through in recent years against quite substantial opposition in certain cases, I think it could be broadly assumed to have the backing of both Putin as well as Medvedev. Things have happened such as the civilianization, or some might say bureaucratization, of the defence ministry, by the appointment to senior positions of a number of former officials of the Federal Tax Service, which I suppose is designed in a way to create more efficiency in the Russian Defence Ministry and in the defence process within the country. Restructuring of the armed services themselves continues. We've seen the armies on-off move towards a brigade structure take place in recent years. Air forces move towards centralisation of satellite bases and airfields into, I think, 15 air bases in recent years. But I think some of the structural issues that bedevil the modernisation process continue, relating to personnel issues, the situation regarding conscripts, contract servicemen, the pay and benefits. In other words, attracting and retaining the right type of staff to fulfil the modern forces the Russians wish to see. Nigel covered the industrial point of view. I just sort of add to that. There's an ageing workforce, there's increasing competition from other sectors in Russia. But I think one interesting development has been the procurement of the Mistral vessels from France, which you could see, I suppose, as a way of Russia trying to learn from foreign nations' defence industrial processes in a bid to try and reinvigorate their own industry.
Yes. Just front row here.
Pete Apps, Reuters. If we continue these trend lines, I'm wondering at what stage your projections show China exceeding the US in terms of defense budget?
Well, Giri, with Gendron?
Yeah. At the moment, the projections that we've put out have to do with the comparison between NATO European spending and Asian spending as a whole. And we're saying that this year we expect that the latter will exceed the former. Chinese defense spending is significantly lower than the United States. It's probably about an eighth, less than an eighth of US defense spending. It's going to be many, many years before they even approximate the US levels of expenditure. Just as a comparison, in terms of global defense expenditure, the United States spends about 45% of global defense spending. China spends about 5.5% of global defense spending. So we're talking, the far-flung future in terms of. We'd have to calculate out the projection, but I'd say at least 15 years. But bearing in mind, our projections are based on market exchange rates. When you compare the US with China, there is an argument to say that you should use purchasing power exchange rates. The timescale will be slightly less if that's the case. But as China modernizes, you will see a migration away from purchasing power parity exchange rates towards the market exchange rates. But still, 10, 15 years. Yeah, easily, yes.
And then, yes.
Abdullah Hamoud, a journalist. Your use of the term the Arab awakening implies more of a durable impact than a seasonal Arab Spring. Do you see the impact in the Middle East as lasting, and also how the West and the world is prepared to deal with democratically elected Islamic governments in so many countries?
Toby Dodge?
Yeah, I think there are three. A year later, we can have a better analytical grasp on the impact of the Arab Spring, and there are kind of three broad outcomes. The first, which is the majority, is that states have successfully managed or repressed the uprisings that we've been witnessing, and so no great change there. The second, I think, in Tunisia and especially Egypt, is the quite spectacular change with real parliamentary democracy, at least, putting pressure on the ruling elites and moving towards some form of greater pluralism. And the third and most worrying change, I suppose, is the move in Libya and Syria into civil war, and so greater destabilization. So it's those two outcomes of the spring that I think will remain with us in a minority of countries, greater pluralization and democratization so far in Tunisia and Egypt, but also greater instability in Libya and Syria.
Yes?
Darren Lake from Shepherd Media. Two quick questions. One is on the cyber warfare side of things. Could you just explain a little bit more how you've defined and quantified that? And then the second question is on combat support. Why add that in now? Is that just about being completion, or is there some sort of change in the way that things are working now that you have to quantify combat support much more?
Well, James Hackett first, and then Nigel, if you want to add anything on cyber specifically.
On cyber and how we've done it, I think last year at this event we talked a little bit about this because we had an essay on it, and we said there are difficulties in, you can't count computers and things like that. So the way we're starting to do it is look at doctrines, organizations, look at the resources that states are starting to devote to this issue. And from that you can build up a more sort of qualitative analysis of how seriously people are taking it, what state resources they're devoting to it, the split between military, security and civil in terms of infrastructure and responsibilities. So that's sort of how we're doing it rather than certainly a quantitative study. We're trying to be more qualitative and look at organizations.
Ben, you want on combat support?
Up to this year, the military balance didn't properly cover that area. And for the uninitiated, in the case of armies, that's capabilities like artillery, engineers, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, without which you don't have a full spectrum capability. With just infantry and armour, you have a shot window capability and a capability to do a limited amount of repression. And if you want to form a proper assessment of an army's capability, you've got to look at combat, the support, and also the logistics and medical, the combat service support. And if you want an example that brings this, I think, vividly to life, early in the Libyan war, the defenders of Misrata erected quite effective anti-tank obstacles that kept the Gaddafi regime out of the city centre of Misrata. The Gaddafi regime didn't have combat engineers or armoured engineers that could breach those obstacles under fire, because if they had, they could have ended the siege of Misrata.
Nigel?
On cyber, I would simply say that to do this properly, one needs to look at the kind of whole of society approach. One needs to look at the levels of industrial capacity, education, internet penetration, capacity for indigenous innovation. All of these things come into the assessment. But the key thing in all of this is the extent to which national governments have sought to capture and exploit the capabilities, the cyber capabilities that that exist in their countries. And the extent to which this has been done varies very considerably. If we look at the examples we cite this year, Taiwan, for example, is generally reckoned to be an advanced cyber society with significant indigenous production capacity and a certain degree of innovation. But there's very little evidence that the Taiwanese government, the Taiwanese armed forces, have yet sought to capture and brigade these capabilities in a militarily meaningful way. So I think that to my mind is the key issue here. To what extent governments have done this and how they've done this. To what extent they've gone down the militarization route, or, as in the case of the United Kingdom, consciously eschewed an approach which risks militarizing the cyber domain.
Yes. Gentleman there in the blue, behind your own camera.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. Martin Benedict from the AP. Could I ask whether you think there is any way, as things stand, that the Syrian rebels can win? And also, do you think there is any justification for Israel to launch a preemptive strike on Iran? And more particularly, could that actually achieve what Israel wishes it to achieve?
Well, I'll answer the latter question and give Toby Dodge 60 seconds to think about the capacities of the Syrian opposition. The military balance, of course, doesn't make predictions. It assesses capabilities, both qualitative and quantitative. But my judgment is that an Israeli attack on Iran of an overt kind, of the kind that has been most talked about, is unlikely this year. We had an exchange between Netanyahu and Obama over the last few days in Washington that was meant to achieve an understanding. And while Israel is particularly concerned about Iran entering this so-called zone of immunity when it is able to put its centrifuges in Fordo, that concern is a particular sovereign concern, because it then makes it more difficult for Israel alone to destroy that facility. And Netanyahu wanted an assurance from the United States, in effect, that if Israel took U.S. advice and did not attack prematurely, that when the threat matured, the United States would, if all other options had failed, use the military option, and that assurance he got from Obama last week. So my judgment is that it is unlikely that there be an attack this year. Both Israel and the United States are conscious that Israel can conduct a raid, only the United States can conduct a campaign. And I think it is the latter that would be necessary in order to delay in any meaningful way the acquisition of a confirmed Iranian nuclear military capacity. It still remains the case that the judgment of most military experts is that any attack, whether a raid or a campaign, would only delay such acquisition and could, of course, incentivize the regime once it reorganizes itself to move ever quicker towards that goal. Syria.
Thank you. The way that the demonstrations against the regime militarized in response undoubtedly to extended aggressive suppression is that has left, if we can even call them the Free Syrian Army, fractured, highly localized, based on kind of village and town neighborhood patterns of organization. So that means although they're an irritant, they're no direct threat to the Syrian regime. We've seen so the Syrian regime can suppress specific areas but cannot completely remove the military opposition to it. So what we're in is a form of kind of bloody attrition where the Syrian regime will be able to control the main urban centers of the country, which gives it 70% of the population. The opposition will be able to pop up, take suburbs, and then be forced out of them, as we've seen in Homs. So I think, there is no basic way a lightly armed, poorly centralized force can pose a direct threat to the regime if and unless it triggers such a response from Damascus using air power, using even more violence than in Homs, that the international community is forced to react. And I don't see them doing that yet. And of course, secondly, we've had a greater drumbeat, especially from Qatar, to fund and to put weapons in there. But then again, from such a low base, I don't think that's going to solidify, give the command and control and the centrality to the Free Syrian Army to pose a sustained threat. So no, in short.
At the back, right there. Yes, you, sir. You stand up and the microphone will move to you. Thank you.
Hani Bishra, Al Jazeera Channel. It has been argued that what's happening in Syria at the moment reflects a new Cold War. Do you think that the Russian and the military and the Chinese military capabilities play any role in that? In other words, what's happening in Syria, if we look at it from a wider picture, does that reflect a new power balance in the world today? Thank you.
I think the judgment to that is broadly no, that Russia and China have a political view as to what the international community, personified by the United Nations, should or shouldn't do in respect to the internal politics of a sovereign state, and they have demonstrated that view through the veto of the UN Security Council resolution. That hasn't prevented China from looking carefully at how it engages with the region, and Russia to supporting Kofi Annan's special envoy role in Syria. But the role in which Russia and China have played in Syria is primarily political, and I don't think there's any significant military interpretation that one can give to that activity. Yeah.
It's Ryan Parry from the Daily Mirror. Just wondering whether it's possible to quantify to what extent not having a working aircraft carrier hinders the UK's military capabilities. In particular, to what extent would the UK be able to launch an attack to retake the Falklands? I know we've touched on that, but it'd be interesting to know a bit more detail about that.
Shall we do Doug and then Christian in whatever order you choose between yourselves? Christian first.
Sure. I'm a bit confused by the phrase quantify. I don't think we can put a number on this particularly. Obviously, not having an aircraft carrier deprives the UK of carrier strike capabilities, which are useful in many different situations. They probably would have been very useful in Libya, for instance, and the French use of the aircraft carrier demonstrated its utility. That doesn't mean that the UK is unable to project power, and it's still able to project rotary wing capabilities as well. Whether it would affect any theoretical attempt to retake the Falklands on behalf of the UK, it would obviously offer less air cover, and that would be a detriment to any particular campaign, but it doesn't mean that the campaign wouldn't be successful. I mean, it's tough to talk about aircraft carrier capabilities without putting them in a specific context and knowing exactly what they're up against and what they're being used for.
Anything to add?
I'd just add that it's a capability gap for the moment. Obviously, the UK will return to having a carrier strike capability at some point later on in this decade. It's really a nice to have rather than an absolutely need to have.
Anything else? Yes.
I'm Dan Silva with IHS Janes. This is going off of Gary's answer before. What do you all believe over the next 20 to 30 years, given the rise in the militarization of the Asia Pacific, is the possibility that conflict will erupt there?
Adam Ward, conflict in the Asia-Pacific over the next generation.
Well, you have to look at the Asia-Pacific, and if you do decide that all strategic life is there, essentially, you're looking at very non-traditional forms of security challenges that are transnational in nature, but you're also looking at very much entrenched state-to-state antagonisms. You're looking at a high degree of defense expenditure, and you're looking at a high degree of interstate competition. It's the region that is most strewn with the sort of flashpoints that would drag the US into a confrontation, obviously, with China. And it's also the region where the US is most fearful of strategic displacement by China. So clearly, North Korea, Taiwan, the South China Sea, all of these are potential contingencies and flashpoints. It's difficult to add a weighting of probability to where the flashpoint is likely to properly ignite. But clearly, yes, I mean, I think it's something that deserves continuing vigilance and attention. That's what the military balance is continuing to do.
Anything else? Yes?
News today that 6 British soldiers have lost their life in Afghanistan, were appears to, from the MOD in Helmand. Is enough being done for a transition to the Afghan soldiers, and do you really believe that we can pull our troops out in 2014? Mandy Siegel, by the way, Al Jazeera English.
Maybe Ben Barry first and Nigel Inkster, if you'd like to add anything.
If the question is enough being done for transition, broadly speaking, in terms of military resources put into developing the Afghan National Security Forces, the answer is pretty much yes. And what we have seen with, for example, the British contingent and the Danish contingent is, as transition's been going on, resources and people have been shifted from combat role into training and mentoring. And I don't think there's any significant shortage of resources. If you look at the campaign more broadly, what's quite clear is in the last couple of years, the surge has had positive security effects in southern Afghanistan, in Kandahar and Helmand provinces, where the majority of US reinforcements have gone. From a military point of view, the challenge for this year is eastern Afghanistan, what NATO calls Regional Command East, which is the heartland of a number of insurgent networks, including the Haqqani network, and up to September last year was being used as the springboard for the very successful spectacular attacks into Kabul, which had a headline-grabbing effect, even though violence in Kabul accounts for less than 1% of the incidents. And as Secretary Panetta described in his testimony last autumn, the challenges in Regional Command East are even greater than the South in terms of terrain and tribal geography, and the presence of considerable insurgent base areas across the border in the tribal areas of Pakistan. And bearing in mind what NATO has said about the pace of transition to Afghans and how they're increasingly assume the lead in 2013, my suspicion is events in Regional Command East during this fighting season are likely to be decisive.
I mean, I would simply add that notwithstanding what Ben said about the transition of Western forces from combat to training roles, we will, I think, see a continuing tempo of special forces night raids for as long as these prove politically sustainable within Afghanistan. And of course, this is an issue that's coming into much starker relief as the status of forces agreement is in the process of being negotiated. These night raids are very, very politically unpopular in Afghanistan. Karzai is under enormous pressure from his domestic constituencies to try to end these raids, yet they have been one of the most effective weapons in the NATO ISAF armory. So it'll be interesting to see how sustainable this approach continues to be.
Thank you very one more then. Yes.
Hello, I'm Inigo Vigavea from the Spanish National Radio. After the Arab Spring, what's been the impact of arms trade and exports to Arab countries?
after the Arab Spring. I don't know whether
more,
we
more
can...
cautious maybe in exporting type of arms that have been exported to Arab countries.
So general arms trade to the Gulf, Middle East? I think the broad answer to the question is that, of course, the Gulf countries in particular continue to buy a great deal of military equipment. They're animated primarily by their concern for Iran. Obviously, in one or two specific cases, export licenses have been withheld. The United States and the United Kingdom, in the case of Bahrain, have withheld export licenses where they have viewed that some of the equipment that possibly could be transferred would be used to suppress internal dissent. But strategically, there hasn't yet been a major change. Of course, the probable resolution of the NGO issue between the United States and Egypt was significant in this context, insofar as there was a concern by those in the United States who wanted to maintain that security relationship with Egypt, that people might call for the $1.3 billion of aid to the Egyptian military possibly to be suspended, withdrawn if this political crisis were to continue. That looks to be settled, and the United States has made clear that it wants to continue having a strategic relationship with the Egyptian military, not least in the context of their interest in ensuring that Egypt continues as is expected to respect the Camp David Accord. So I think there have been certain changes in accents owing to the early days and months after the Arab awakening, but the U.S., which is the main arms supplier to the region, has not seen its strategic interests yet so changed that there would be a dramatic altering in the flow or direction or target of military assistance and arms sales. With that, thank you very much. Copies of the military balance are available for all of you who were good enough to attend as you exit this room, and we look forward to reading your analysis.